So what I'm going to stop and do is I'm going to go to share screen and share the things as I'm moving through these. And let's see what we've got. So the first thing I'm going to share is I am going to share. You should be able to see the application now. And I'm going to share what I call a working outline with you. I'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation today. When I use outlines, I guess it's very nice to make them for my family, and I do, but mainly I make these outlines so that I can put information in as I find it. That means I can do it before, during, or after my research for a particular thing. I can keep adding things in, but my main thing is if you notice here, anything in red, those are questions. Those are things that are near and dear to me in terms of being able to look at this fellow that we're going to look at today and look at the National Records Center while we do it. Andrew Solomon Quist was my great uncle, or either great or great. He was a pretty neat fellow. I'm just going to show you 10 years, actually 8 years of his life here. I'm going to make you aware of the fact that he and his family were living in Grafton, Walsh County, Dakota Territory by 1885. In 89, of course, just like Montana, North Dakota became a state. And in 1898, Andrew and his brother, Sim, were members of the North Dakota Infantry Company C1, and they went to the Philippines. They were musicians. Keep that in your mind because you'll see a little bit about it later on. I promptly went out to something that I'm very fortunate to have, and that is stories at the Quist family reunion site out at Facebook. And there were 2 pictures, which I will show you, courtesy of one of my other cousins. Boy, has Facebook been a bonus for that. I found Andrew became a U.S. deputy marshal. And I thought that was pretty cool, but I didn't know anything about it. He served under the North Dakota U.S. Marshal at the pleasure of the U.S. Marshal. They could be fired at any time, although mostly the U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Deputy Marshal served at least 4 years at a time. You're going to see that Andrew served 2 of those 4-year hitches as a U.S. Deputy Marshal. When I found out that he was there, I wanted to know immediately who hired him. Well, I found that out. Was there a place I could find his records? And I'd run across the U.S. Personnel Archives a long time ago at St. Louis, Missouri. I've even waved at that building. I knew his war records will be at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., because he served prior to 1915. After that, you'll most generally find what you can find of the records. You'll find them at the U.S. Personnel Archives in St. Louis. And by the way, I found his boss's name at the U.S. Marshal site. I was able, many years ago, actually 10 years ago, I found his pay stubs out at genealogybank.com. That's a paid site for newspapers, just one of them. So anyway, this will be the one page that I'm giving you, and I'll just show you a couple of features that I have in my working timeline because it works for me. I put questions here. When I've answered those questions, I'd use the little thingy, that's a professional term. I use the little line through it thingy from Word, and that tells me that the question has been answered. And I'll usually put the answer there also. For this one, I highlighted in black the 2 pay stubs that I found. Then I said, boy, this guy got around North Dakota. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, and he was busy. And so every place that he went, I put in capital letters because I want to be able to put it on a map,
Mm.
a timeline map. Also, because I was aware that they did many varied and unusual things after reading the job description for them, and you'll see that in just a couple of minutes, I highlighted everybody that he hooked just in 2, 3, and 4 that I could find in the newspapers. This won't be everyone, but I found all of these things in the newspapers out at Chronicling America. So here was one held for selling liquor to the Indians. In 1 week, he picked up a guy who robbed a post office. He also picked up a guy who raised, that is, converted into his own money, a postal money order. Another guy who was in for a rape indictment. Several other guys who were cutting timber from government land. That all in 1 week, taking them before grand juries or delivering them to prisons. He was a busy guy. So everything that you see in here that's in bold behind one of the perps, as I call them, it just means this is what he did, because I wanted to know how unusual this job was. And boy, was it unusual. And then in green down here at the bottom, you'll see in the midst of all of that, he took a few days in September and got married. Then he continued the job for another 6 years. So that's a little bit of what that particular thing looks like. So I'm going to stop the share on this. You won't see this now until you actually get your handout. I'm going back to share the screen and go into the actual presentation now. I will show you one other thing that I do have. How do I find these things and put them in order? When I'm looking at something like Chronicling America and I want to throw scans in, I get myself a piece of paper from Word and just start plunking the stuff in and make a visual timeline out of it. This one ended up being 18 or 19 pages, but it's the articles real quick so I can read them. And so I've got that for my background research and also for my source. I want to be able to do that. So that's what those look like. And I'm not going to show you everything because gosh, it goes on forever here. If you want copies of something like that to look at, as my friend Linda says, it's only Tron's. I'll be happy to send it to you. So this is, and let's go into the slideshow. If it'll, yes, I know they can see this. I want to see the slideshow. So this is where we'll begin the actual presentation. So today I'm talking about U.S. Marshals, kind of incidentally, but it's very dear and very important to me because of this fellow, Andrew Solomon Quist. His father, by the way, was in the Civil War. His father was Andrew P. Quist. He was with the 1st Minnesota. And if you're not aware of how famous that group is, all but 32 of them were sacrificed on the battlefield at Gettysburg. He's one that did survive. He was in several hospitals, and by being able to get his folder, his military folder at NARA, I was able to find out just scads and scads of things about this fella. But back to this presentation. This is about U.S. Marshals and other federal employees. Many times we have federal employees, maybe even currently, and the wonder is, how can you get a hold of that? I mean, without getting a lawyer involved or whatever, how could you get hold of an employee record, or where are these records? I have always been cautious about looking for materials locally because I knew that the Fed records wouldn't be held closely within states, or I thought they wouldn't be. And what I'm going to tell you today is, even if we're looking at the National Record Center, the National Personnel Record Center, you're still going to find these records many other places. So the U.S. Marshal's Office, of course, that one of the most famous things that we probably all know is that they were created by Congress's Judiciary Act of 1789. And at that point, one of their most important duties was taking the census, which they started in 1790. They were the official census takers. And boy, wouldn't that have been quite a census to be taking the information off of, because of course there were no forms. They didn't have lists beforehand of places to go. They had to,
Lady from Great Falls. Oh.
they really had to roam. Their duties were broad. They were to support the federal court within a judicial district and to carry out any lawful orders issued by the President of the United States, the U.S. Congress, and the federal court. Now, as you know, there are 90 or so federal court jurisdictions across the United States today. There weren't that many in 1789, of course. Their tenure is a 4-year term, renewable by the president. In other words, they had to be acted on by the president. Their deputies, however, because they had to have some help many times, were hired actually by the U.S. Marshal that had been appointed, and they served at the pleasure of that particular U.S. Marshal. Now, I can tell you that there is, out at the U.S. Marshals Service, some recommended reading materials. Those of you who know me know that I'm going to give you a considerable list. I didn't give you this as a list today because it's about 3 pages long. But you will be able to go out there. You will see this site again so that you can see what the reading list is. Heck, you might have even found out that you've read some of these things because some of them are just pretty exciting. Well, a U.S. Marshal and his deputy or deputies, in the case of this particular Quist fellow, had to have a lot of on-the-job training. Now, Quist, as you know, and could have seen beforehand, he served in the U.S. Army in the Philippines. And so he had some kinds of job training there, and they knew he had good work habits. Well, marshals and their deputies, they still do this today, by the way. They serve subpoenas, summonses, writs, warrants, other processes issued by the courts, the U.S. district courts. They make the arrests and they handle the prisoners. Think of this carefully. This is mind-boggling. At the point we're talking about, they also dispersed the money for the court. The marshals paid the fees and the expenses of court clerks. They paid the fees and the particular jobs performed by U.S. attorneys, the jurors and witnesses. They even, where they had to, they rented the courtrooms and the jail space, and they hired the bailiffs, the criers, that is the hear ye, hear ye's, and the janitors even. So if you were going to be a U.S. Marshal, or you were going to be a U.S. deputy working under that marshal, you were going to learn to do many things about handling money, handling a varied number of fees and expenses. You're going to learn how to handle witnesses, jurors, and all the warrants and all of the other summonses and so on issued by courts. And you're going to have to make sure that they are legally prepared. Wow. When we're talking about this era of 1900 to 1910, I can tell you this is most likely the type of badge that Andrew Quist wore. Each state, however, or each U.S. district court jurisdiction could kind of make up its own thing. So if you see some of these in your family, don't be surprised if you see them or see that they look very different. They also had some jurisdictions overseas, by the way, so don't be surprised if you see some jurisdictions from overseas by these U.S. court people. This one happens to be the one that I could see that I could match most closely. No, I don't have one for my family. I'm hoping with the cousin bait that I have out there at the Quist family reunion site that somebody brings this up and says, oh, I found that. That'd be a really great thing. This is Andrew, as I know him from a family picture. And again, I'll show you the person who gave me these. This Quist family reunion site really helped me with a couple of pictures. There he is, and he's a pretty solemn-faced fellow. There he's about 14, dressed quite nicely. There, you're going to see proof that he was in the 1898 Philippines War out at footnote. I found this stuff, not the picture, but the information about him and the proof that he and his brother both served in that war out at images available online in 2009. So that's been 11, 12 more years ago, 12, 13 years ago that I found this. But I am indebted to second cousin for the actual picture. By the way, this is Andrew on the left and his brother Sim on the right. And if you notice, I'm just going to backspace here. If you notice, yes, they both played a type of horn, and that figures very, very much so into the family. Let me just tell you right now, for some of the Montana people, yes, the Quist family is a musical family, and guess who these folks are related to? Or should I say Rob Quist is related to them later. That photo, or the two photos, are thanks to a cousin, Dan Larson, out at that Quist family reunion. And he just had a picture out there that said, Sim was my great-grandfather. This picture was taken in the Philippines, where they both served in the Spanish-American War with the North Dakota Regiment. They were both musicians. They often played in the local Salvation Army band after they'd served in the Army. So let me see. I've got this fella, Andrew, and as a young man, he went to war. Then he came back. He had been playing, I found out he'd been playing with the local Salvation Army band in Jamestown, North Dakota, and a couple of other places prior to the war. And so this is what I knew about him at one point. And this is just my particular timeline taken now out of the data information software that I use, Roots Magic 8. So I knew his birth. I've looked at him in various censuses, found him in the military, and I found his occupation for, it's actually 1902 through 1910. He was stationed at Fargo in Cass County, North Dakota, with the U.S. District Court there, and he was a deputy marshal. So before we go any further, and just quickly, I want to talk to you about my working timelines, because that's one thing you're going to get today, just one page of it. It helps me to keep track of a project. For example, I regard Andrew S. Quist at this point as a project. Before I can write about him, I have to have this information all in one place. It allows me to keep the information and to flow from all sources as I grow the outline. If I find out an article about him before 1902, I can still plunk it into this particular timeline, because I can do that. I can insert stuff within the timeline. It allows me to make notes and to include my sources and in source info, so I don't have to seek them out later on or say, oh, doggone, I've got to go back and find that stuff. No, I can do it. I can put it here, and then when it comes time, I can copy and paste it into the other materials I have. It allows you to insert helpful events, the disasters, the epidemics, and more. If I were doing this one and I had inserted events, I happen to know that later on, Andrew lived in California. He'd always been interested in it. So I'd probably put that 1906 California earthquake near San Francisco, or in San Francisco, into this. It helps me to keep my proven facts, my questions, my notes in an organized linear document. And it's very helpful when I go to an archive for research. When I went to Norway the first time in 2005, I took only my notes in a 40-page timeline, and they let me use those right in the archive, because they could see that nothing was original documents. I was very fortunate with that. Doesn't always happen. A lot of the time, they'll just give you a pencil without an eraser and then let you in. So this is what that timeline looks like. Again, I've abbreviated it a little bit so you can just see that I have questions in there or commentary. I mean, that 1903 thing in October, where he did so many people, worked so many people in 1 week, taking them to prison, getting other prisoners and so on, taking them to grand jury hearings. Wow. I can see how a guy having to work with stuff like this would rapidly may get burnout. I do know that at this point there was a U.S. Marshal, and he had 3 deputies. And in 1910 or 1911, he got an extra deputy. When Andrew left this job, by the way, in 1910, he was the lead deputy U.S. Marshal for that particular place. Well, I was able to find out where his boss was by looking out at that fabulous site out on the internet that has things about U.S. Marshals. It has their hirings and firings and pretty much it. No, before you ask, I don't know what the C means and I don't know what the CA means. I looked back and doggone it, they didn't put it there. So what have I found that was fun? Well, way long ago, I'll tell you, in 2012, I found his pay stubs. How did I find those? I was out at genealogybank.com. Warning, it costs dollars. It's a newspaper site, and they have government documents in there. And I threw in the Quist name in the first place and found this dude coming up and found that from November 1, 1902 through June 30, 1903, he was paid $599.20. And then again in June 30, 1904 through through January 1, 1905, he was paid $900. So his pay had increased. I haven't found the things in between that, but you'll see if you look at the timeline, I found a place to put that into a timeline. That's valuable information. And by the way, if you were thinking about it, I did not take the time to convert that to today's pay stub, but he did okay. I went out and I looked at newspapers because I just couldn't find more in the government documents. So here's an example of one of those documents. I don't have the date on it, but Clerk Montgomery of the U.S. Court and Deputy Marshal Quist were in the city today and adjourned the term of U.S. Court until April 19, when the court will convene for the trial of several civil cases. So notice that they were in the city and they adjourned the term. That's very interesting to see that terminology. So where did I find these things? I mean, I hadn't even gotten to the U.S. Personnel Center yet. Well, I found them in Genealogy Bank, which, as you know, has several federal publications, and they're well worth looking for things there. They've done a variety of things and they continue to scan even more every month, and they have millions of the federal documents. The local city county directories for 1910, I was able to find him. The newspaper articles about his job, mainly apprehending all those perps or perpetrators or presumed perps. I found those by looking out at Chronicling America, and that's a free site, as you know. I also found stuff at the U.S. Marshal government site. You'll have that. And the reason I show this is, guess what? There are things just like this U.S. Marshal government site. There are things for the U.S. Forest Service. There's things for the Civilian Conservation Corps. There's just all kinds of things for people who are employed by the government. Seek and you will find them. There are a couple of books that we have in our library here at the Great Falls Society's library on, there are 2 books, 2 official histories. I was hoping they'd have a list of everybody. Boy, was I naive, but it is the official history. This one is the latest one, going from about 1945 forward, and another book too. And it does give me a nice overview, which is very cool. Out at that U.S. Marshal site today, you can also find for each and every state and for the overseas places, you can find the actual areas of service for North Dakota, for example, and who the current U.S. Marshal is, what all courthouses they serve, where their district office contacts are, what they provide for prisoner services, the US courts and not only their jurisdictions, but their court calendars and the district's most wanted fugitives. Every one of these are slightly different. I did the one for Montana too, and it was interesting, but different again. So let's now take a look at, and I'll go back again, sorry, at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Linda Long and I drove past there a few years ago. And I must admit at that point, I was thinking military records primarily, but there are lots of civilians who work for the government. And this is where you're going to find lots of those things. In fact, their services have gotten so big. Of course, they have many buildings where they store things, but they also have an annex in Valmeyer, Illinois. It's a retrofitted cave, by the way. And keep that in mind because I'll show you a little later in this presentation what exactly is there that you might find interesting. Because what you would get at the National Personnel Records Center is you would get a record of, with very helpful notes and an address for the place to go for Valmeyer, Illinois. Let's hope that they just keep scanning even more documents. By the way, one of the most important things for you to know is even when someplace like this isn't totally open during COVID, there are people who live in the St. Louis area who do research at this place. They will not tell you who's the best researcher, but there is a list out there of people who can do personal research for you to find information there. So when you look at these personnel records, there's some really interesting ways out at the archives.gov St. Louis to look at them. You can bink into the military personnel records. If the veteran separated from the military before 1959, they have quite a few records. If the veteran separated from the military service after 59, they have some records. They will hasten to tell you that they had a fire, and that fire, which coupled with water damage, destroyed many of the veteran records. You also need to know, however, that this might be a little misleading. The military personnel records, if you're a veteran separated from the military service before 1915, maybe down to 1910, you're far more likely to find them, the records, the actual records, the jackets, as it were, at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And there is a place out at NARA, out at the NARA site, nara.gov, for you to look and to actually complete a form if you want to, and get that particular veteran's documents. Say it's a Revolutionary War record, or it's a Civil War record, or it's a record from the 1898 Philippines or the Cuba adventure of that era. You will find them at NARA, and it's surprising to see what I've gotten. I know that for my great-great-grandfather, Mr. Quist, I have a file that is more than a half-inch thick of his pay stubs, of his hospital records when he was in the hospital in Philadelphia, twice actually, because he was first injured at Antietam, and later, of course, he was grievously injured at Gettysburg. And those records are all there. His later records, when they sent him home and he joined another outfit and came right back, are there. There won't be as much in later personnel records, perhaps. If you're looking at civilian personnel records, my recommendation is that you look at the list both at St. Louis and also at NARA for all the places that federal civil servant employment records can be found. Some of the agencies have saved their own, and the list is long. I cannot provide it here. But A lot of these records are at St. Louis, and they're pretty much open to everybody. If the federal civil servant employment ended before 1952. If it ended in 1952 or after, there's a limited amount of information that you can get, but it's well worth looking at those records. So some of those things for the Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, will be there for some states, not all of them. Again, you're going to find that this is one primary place, and it's a good one to know because it also has resident researchers available to you. But you're also going to have to look out at the NARA site. When I go to NARA, I look on the front page, I look downward to the genealogy space and look in there first. And then when I want to go on from that and do some other things, I will look further. And if you notice, these are hot links here. You can go right to this link, for example, if a federal civil servant employment ended before 1952, and it's a hot link. So it'll take you into the next piece of information. I'll warn you, this site is really big. So how do I find an employment record and who has these? Well, if it's a record that is of a civilian, that is a civilian who works for the government, the Office of Personnel Management might be handling it. For example, the Forest Service records. Some of them are here. Some of them are still in other places. For example, if you are looking at a particular Forest Service record in which the Forest Service got involved in a particular court suit, you may find that actual record at the actual U.S. court archive for that particular court. Remember, the employment has to have ended prior to 1952 if you're going to get pretty much open access. And it's good to know in the first place that NARA, the National Archives, got ownership of certain of these records in 2009 and sent many of these things right to the site in St. Louis. They are open to the public, so you have to see the list of personnel types to see what's open and what's not. No, the J. Edgar Hoover records are not here. How can I get a record? Well, if you're an individual, you can access these records by submitting a request, and they have the requirements there. Actually, they have forms there. So when I send this out to you, you're going to be able to see these. You can submit a written request. You can do it via email. You can submit a written request with the address. If you are requesting a Civilian Conservation Corps or a Works Progress Administration employee record, use the standard form. It says available to the right. I obviously took this right off the site. They're going to be emailed or sent via postal mail, and then your invoice will be sent via email. They will not send you an invoice until you have received the document. Please, please make sure you pay your bill so that the rest of us don't get stymied. Visiting the archival research room, you can do that by appointment only. Right now, I warn you, that part is closed down and they only have 25% of their people working right now. But you will be able to schedule an appointment. I hope that by early summer, this thing will be fully open. Wouldn't that be a fun field trip? Yeah. You can employ one of their independent researchers to examine the records, and don't quote me, I might be wrong, but they intimate at this site that independent researchers that they know are being permitted in there as they do some limited openings. No, limited openings that they've been doing. You can submit these particular things. Oh, I've got the same thing there. Pardon me, I'll have to take that slide out. In your requests, identify the record needed, explain the purpose of your request. Certain basic information is required to locate civilian personnel records. I cannot begin to tell you how many people who have said, you know, Quist is kind of an unusual name, so it shouldn't be hard to find. If you saw all the people who are Quists in the United States and across the world today, you'd know that that's not a good bet. So you want their full name used during federal employment. So for my daughter who worked for the Forest Service, and full disclosure, she is now deceased, so it's okay to put this information out. Her full name then was Carrie Lee Thomson. I would need her date of birth, the name and the location of the employing federal agency. She worked for the U.S. Forest Service out of the Missoula offices in 1991, 1992, the beginning and ending dates, and her social security number. And so those are some of the things basically that they need to even look at a particular person and the employment record. What about the official personnel folders after 1952? They're still in the legal custody of the Office of Personnel Management. They don't have all of them again. Some of the agencies keep some of theirs. They are available through some restricted use. For example, given the example of my daughter, she's deceased. Some copies of some documents and some information about the deceased may be releasable with a proof of a subject's death. So that would be a certified death certificate. But that proof of death is not required if the subject of the record was born more than 100 years ago. And they have a specific place for you to go for those records when you look at them. And by the way, they have still one more barrier. Anybody who separated from federal service after 1973, those records are in the annex up in that Illinois limestone retrofitted cave. They'll give you a very nice address and a place to go. And hopefully, because I haven't checked this out, but hopefully maybe some local researchers who are permitted at times to go in there and look at those materials. There are some interesting things, just looking at the military records really quickly. There are some people called OMPFs, or Official Military Personnel Files and Persons of Exceptional Prominence, the PEPs. Those are open to the public right now. They might be military heroes, political leaders, cultural figures, celebrities, entertainers. Some are digital. I would expect to find Bob Hope at this site. Some are black and white copies only at the archival research room, but you can order copies of some of these things if you're interested in celebrities. And they have a list of them out at the site. Go out to persons of exceptional prominence, put that into their search, and these will come up. It looks like this. And some of these, you can see if there's a number after them, they've actually been uploaded to the site, to their online site, and they are available full text right there. They are busy trying to get all of these out full text on the site, so you can just go and look at these particular things. I imagine that, you know, there's a new book out and a new project out on our former Vice President, Spiro Agnew. And he's one of them that has full text down here near the bottom. As you can see, the second one from the bottom, and his is available. And I imagine it would have been quite helpful to the people who were putting that particular story together. And that's going to be shown sometime this summer, I believe. It's an actual documentary movie. So where are the records for the NARA for U.S. Marshal Service? I was really consumed with this. So I'm back to my story now with my family. So I went out to NARA and I went to this thing that you'll see right there called the Record Group Explorer. They have a search button, and it looks just like the link that I've given you below. And it says right away, Group 527 has some of these records. It has correspondence, it has the marshal's oaths and bonds, and the docket files. Notice it says it has the marshal's oaths. It doesn't, I believe, for most places anyway, it does not have the deputy marshal oaths and bonds. Doggone it. Those are held in regional NARA archives. And you probably know about the regional NARA archives. We have a couple close to us, one out in Seattle and one in Denver. This particular set of Group 527 records is held in the National Archives at Denver for those Quist records, if there's anything. So that's the next thing I would actually have to go to. Remember, the U.S. Personnel Records Center may send you on to the next place. They will not have everything there, but they will give you a pretty good idea of where the next thing is. Luckily, this kind of thing told me that I would not need to put that first letter in saying, do you have this record, and have them say, no, we don't. I could go to the archives court records site at the National Archives of Denver for my Quist records and look to see what they had. So at the Denver Regional Archives, just looking out there again online, I can see that they had some record groups. They had record group 21 for the records of the district courts of the United States from 1847 to 1995. Well, hooray, because that's just right up my alley. That's exactly what I want in order to find Andrew Solomon Quist. That means they also had the records for the North Dakota and the Dakota Territory from 1868 to 1945, which is a record group 118 of the U.S. attorneys. Remember, the U.S. attorneys worked very, very closely with these deputies and the main officer. So the administrative history says that a judicial act in 1789 made provision for the attorneys and marshals who are appointed by the president and have functioned under the general supervision of the Department of Justice since its creation in 1870. So as you can see, that original 1789 law has been regularly updated as needed. Well, what did I find? Doggone it. I found the records of all of these U.S. attorneys. I found some stuff from Billings, Montana, 1973 to 82. I'm looking down there and saying, come on, you've got to have North Dakota. Well, doggone, they have the North Dakota records, but only 1976 to 1980, which tells me those early records weren't transferred in. Could they have been burned? I don't know. I'm going to have to go investigate that particular thing, see what is happening. So I am looking where to look next. I would not at this point say, well, there must not be anything. Somebody's going to have to show me that there's not anything to be found. So I'm still in the hunt. So I'm back to the North Dakota courts, and I can look at the federal records, 1900 to 1914 U.S. court dockets. So I've got to go there. I at least might be able to get the court dockets for North Dakota and what was happening. I do know that at one point, well, probably 2 points, Andrew Solomon Quist accompanied prisoners to Washington, D.C. itself for hearings. So that's pretty interesting. I found that in the newspaper. The Justice Department has an index to the names of the U.S. Marshals for all those dates. Could they possibly maybe have the deputy U.S. Marshals? I don't know. But wait a minute. Did that U.S. District Court, since it was in Fargo on the border of North Dakota and Minnesota, did it or could it have perhaps archived its records in Minnesota? I mean, sometimes U.S. District Courts get reassembled, as it were. I know that that happened in Great Falls as our courts got larger and we had to include more than one. And so I'm hoping for that. And that's what I'm going to check out next to find out more about Andrew Solomon Quist and his work life. His work life is very interesting to me because he quits work with the U.S. Marshal in 1910. He has served 2 4-year terms at that point. He quits that evidently. I have a reference to the fact that he did not ask to be rehired. And later on, it's interesting, this man becomes a very savvy, keen bookkeeper. And when I think back to all those wonderful skills that he had to have in terms of money management, because not just the U.S. Marshal, but also his deputy marshals in North Dakota took care of those financial records. Sometimes those U.S. Deputy marshals actually were the ones who convened a particular court, and while the U.S. Marshal for North Dakota stayed right there in Fargo. So it's worth looking at. Well, that's my story for today about this particular kind of record and places that you can go.